Alright, so remember completing the square, we have a couple things to set up first to make sure it's in standard form, and it is indeed in standard form. I do have an issue because my a, which is the step 2, is not equal to 1. So to get them all equal, get to my a value equal to 1, I'm going to divide everything by 3. Sometimes we don't have this luxury, we would have to factor out a 3, but in this case it's easier to divide it. We get an x squared plus 2x minus 1/3 is equal to 0. Let's see. Now I can complete the square. I need to figure out what that number would be, so maybe I take a little break and figure out what that will be. Remember, I need to figure out a b over 2 and a b over 2 squared. And on the notes I call this like our step 3 and this our step 4. So in this case, b is equal to 2, so this is 2 over 2 is equal to 1. And I know that this is now 1 squared, which is just equal to 1. Let's see, so let's go back to the original problem. I'll leave a little bit of space. Okay, and then I will add in the positive 1 and subtract it. Okay, group up the first 3, and I know that this will be a perfect squared polynomial. This 1 comes from this 1. It's a coincidence they're both 1. And minus 1 minus 1/3, so I would have to find a common denominator, and this would be 3 over 3. So when I subtract these, I will get a negative 4/3 equal to 0. Okay, and at this point, I have my vertex form. So let me do that over here. This is, if I said f of x, say this was an x plus 1 squared minus 4/3. So that tells me that my vertex is negative 1 comma 4/3. Let's go and solve now. So let's continue. This would be like our step 7 from our notes, where, and I should have given you a little more room over here, x plus 1 squared is equal to 4/3 after I move that negative 4/3 to the right. I'm going to square root each side. Okay, and I know that square root of 4/3 is the same as square root of, 2 over the square root of 3 after I split up the numerator and denominator. But I also have a plus or minus, and then I get an x is equal to negative 1 plus or minus 2 over the square root of 3. And I really don't want to leave this in with the radical on the bottom. If depending on how I ask you, since it says simplify to the nearest 10th or round to the nearest 10th, and I'm looking for a decimal answer in this particular problem. Otherwise, you would rationalize this particular fraction. But I can go ahead and say what the plus version will be and the negative version. So it would be, let's see, this is my positive version where I say negative 1 plus 2 over the square root of 3. That gives me approximately 0.2, and then let's do the subtraction version. Negative 1 minus 2 over the square root of 3, and I get approximately negative 2.2. So these would be my answers. Okay. Let's check out 17. Remember, 2 things I need to check before I complete the square. One is that it's in standard form. Second thing, that my a is equal to 1. Now remember that there are multiple ways to complete the square. So some ways you might be okay with 30 already being on the right. But just to stay consistent, I'm going to move it over so the people that are following those steps know where some of these numbers are coming from. Okay, and I'm looking for the numbers to put here and there, and I will kind of do the work over here where I said, okay, I need to find b over 2, and my b is 7, and if I divide that by 2, it's 7/2. Okay, so that's one number I'll use at some point, and the next number is the b over 2 squared. So that is 7 over 2 squared. This is going to be 49 over 4. And this is the number that I'm going to add. And then subtract. Okay, and I'm grouping these three together in my mind because that would be a perfect squared polynomial, and I could do x plus 7/2, and that 7/2 comes from this. Now I'm going to simplify negative 49/4 minus 30. So let's do that. I would have to multiply top and bottom of that 30 by 4, and I would get negative 49 over 4 minus 120 over 4 equals 0. I'm not gonna put that over to the side. Let's see. X plus 7/2, that quantity squared. Negative 49 minus 120 is negative 169 over 4 equals 0. And I've got an x plus 7/2, that quantity squared. Move the negative 169 over 4 over, and then I can do my square root step. This will be x plus 7 over 2. Oh, by the way, since we're looking for a vertex form, we have it technically right here. And then it was if I made this equal to f of x, perhaps. And then this tells me that my vertex would be a negative 7 over 2, comma, negative 169 over 4. Not the prettiest, but nevertheless your answer. Here I'm going to get square root of 169 over 4, and I know it's going to be a plus or minus version. And the square root of 169, remember I can take that and say this is 169 over 4, so this is going to be 13 over 2. I'll have an x is equal to, move this over in the step by subtracting it from both sides, and get a plus or minus 13 over 2. So my one answer would be the plus version, another version would be the negative. So the positive version would be 7/2 plus 13 over 2. The negative version would be negative 7/2 minus 13 over 2. This would be 6 over 2 or 3. And this one would be negative 20 over 2 or negative 10. Okay, so that one we probably would have been able to factor. Let's see. Probably, no, maybe not. Let's see. We must have been able to if we got 3 and negative 10. Oh yeah, we could have. Let's see, let's check out the number 18. Okay, so I'm going to go through, making sure it's in standard form. Okay, now I want my coefficients of my leading coefficient to be 1, so I'm going to divide each term by 10, so my a will now be 1. And I will just work with some of these fractions even though they aren't the prettiest, and I'll go ahead and complete the square. Now I need to do that step where I figured out those two numbers, the b over 2 and the b over 2 squared. B over 2 would be negative 13 over 10 divided by 2. And I'll either recognize that the 2 would just go into the denominator with the 10, or I can take the negative 13 over 10, multiply it by the reciprocal of 2, or 2 over 1, which is 1/2. And indeed, C will be negative 13 over 20. And then I'm going to take that, go negative 13 over 20, square that, get 169 over 400 as the number that I'm going to add and subtract. So let's go ahead and take this step. Oh, I mean to cross out part of the number. This one here, and get x squared minus 13 tenths x. Leave a blank, minus 9 tenths is equal to 0. The numbers that we're adding are the plus 169 over 400, and I will subtract that same number. I'm grouping these three terms together, and I will get x minus 13 over 20 squared, and then I need to combine negative 169 over 400 minus 9 tenths. Let me move this a little bit over. This number here that I would have to multiply it by is going to have to be 4d over 40. Not pretty. Negative 169 over 400. And 9 times 40 would be negative 360 over 400 equals 0. And then, let's see, continuing to simplify, x minus 13 over 20 squared minus 529 over 400 equal to 0. This is my vertex form. Let's call, say, f of x if we really want to. That's maybe part of it. My vertex in this case would be 13 over 20, comma, negative 529 over 400. Whew, that is an ugly vertex. And then I'm going to solve. So let's bring this whole problem here, and I'm going to get x minus 13 over 20 squared, move this negative 529 to the right over 400, and now it's positive. I want to square root each side, and I get x minus 13 over 20 is equal to the plus or negative version of 529 over the square root of 4. What do you know? 529 is actually a perfect square of 23. And I know that 400 is a perfect square of 20, so now I'm going to continue to solve this. This is x is equal to 13 over 20 plus or minus 23 over 20. Okay, the positive version and the negative version. So let's see. 13 plus 23 would be 36 over 20. Let me simplify this to 9 over 5. As a decimal, that will be 1.8. And then 13 minus 23 will be negative 10 over 20, which will be negative 0.5. Okay. So a lot going on here for these problems.